Właśnie zakończyła się konferencja Public Procurement in Times of Crisis National Experiences, zorganizowana przez University of Tartu School of Law. Niestety do Tartu, na Estonię nie zdołałem dotrzeć osobiście i chciałbym to kiedyś nadrobić, ale sama konferencja była znakomita. Prawno-porównawcze spojrzenie na doświadczenia poszczególnych systemów zamówień publicznych z gwiazdorską obsadą. Bardzo inspirujące i rozwijające. Perspektywę polską reprezentowaliśmy w zespole, którym miałem przyjemność współtworzyć wraz z profesorem Piotrem Bogdanowiczem i profesorem Michałem Kanią. Zakładam, że obu panów już niebawem będę miał przyjemność gościć tutaj na kanale, a w tym filmie w charakterze supportu i wprowadzenia zapraszam na moją część naszego wystąpienia, w którym wyjaśniłem, dlaczego pierwsza reakcja polskiego ustawodawcy na sytuacje kryzysowe to wyłączanie dorobku stosowania przepisów prawa zamówień publicznych. Serdecznie zapraszam. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kola and I would like to emphasize that it is a great pleasure and honor for me to be able to participate in today's conference. This pleasure is especially great for me because I can present a paper on crisis procurement challenges in Poland together with my esteemed colleagues Professor Piotr Bogdanowicz and Professor Michał Kania. I'm speaking to you from Poznań, where I represent the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. The weather is also really bad. I am pleased to begin our speech by characterizing the background. I would like to synthetically point out the key tendency in Polish public procurement law in the context of crisis situations, and this tendency is the phenomenon of establishing extraordinary special legal solutions which are often established outside the main legal act regulating public procurement in our country, which is the Public Procurement Law of September the 11th, 2019. After this brief description, Professor Piotr Bogdanowicz will talk about an extraordinary solution which is willingly used by the Polish legislator in response to the crisis. And which concerns the issue of contract modifications due to unforeseen circumstances. Then Professor Michał Kania will then develop this issue in the section entitled Hardship Clause in the Polish Public Procurement Law in the context of the coronavirus pandemic and the war in Ukraine, pointing out that the trends we see lead to serious problems not only in the context of compliance with EU law, but also problems with the internal coherence of the Polish legal system. We hope that our proposal will be of interest to you. First of all, it is worth recalling that there is a certain tradition in the public procurement market. When a crisis situation occurs, the European Commission issues a communication or informs by other means that contracting authorities can rely on the EU public procurement framework, which provides ways and means to deal with severe emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or the migration crisis earlier, and so on. The tradition is that member states ignore this recommendation and do not rely on the EU public procurement framework and adopt extraordinary measures. These extraordinary measures do not always mean change in the law, but according to the OECD report, about 50% of the countries whose activities were examined by the OECD during the COVID-19 crisis, about 50% of these countries declared to establish specific legal regulations. Therefore, it is worth emphasizing that the phenomenon I'm talking about does not concern only Poland. It has a global character, but I believe this phenomenon is particularly intense in Poland, in my country. This phenomenon in Poland is usually based on two elements. Firstly, the legislator is willing to introduce regulations on amendments to concluded contracts, and this issue will be discussed by my colleagues in the next part of this presentation. And secondly, the legislator is particularly willing to exclude the obligation to apply the provisions of the public procurement law. The first case of coronavirus was detected in Poland on March 4, 2020. On March 8, the Act on Special Solutions Related to the Prevention, Control and eradication of COVID-19 entered into force. The legislature decided that the provisions of public procurement law did not apply to contracts for services or supplies necessary to combat COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 was a completely new and unique experience for our societies, so such an action can be considered justified. On the other hand, we must remember that such actions have economic consequences. In Poland, the contracts excluded under the provision, I quoted, did not have a significant impact on the market. Their value in 2021 was 2 parts per thousand of the total value of public contracts awarded on the basis of PPL. However, 450 million of Polish zlotys, about 100 million of euro, is not a small amount of money. What's more, as a practitioner, in the first days of COVID-19, I received at least a few calls asking whether the renovation of a resort, which the client had been unable to organize in the previous years, could be considered a procurement excluded under the provision I present on this slide. We must also emphasize that COVID is not the only trigger that encouraged the Polish legislator to exclude the obligation to apply the provisions of the public procurement law. Similar provisions have been established in legal acts that I mention on this slide. Recently, the triggers were COVID-19, the immigration crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border, the war in Ukraine, and even inflation. In the last of the listed legal acts, it was decided that the public procurement law would not be applied by municipalities when they fulfill their obligations in the field of organizing the sale of solid fuel for households due to the situation on the energy market. That's why I am saying, when in fear, not only God is near, but when in fear, avoiding the public procurement law is also near. The key question is why? Why is the legislator so eager to exclude public procurement law in every crisis situation? I do not have a definite answer to this question, but I do have several hypotheses which I formulate not only as an academic researcher but also as a practitioner. I am not a specialist in the application of public procurement law in other member states, but from time to time I have an opportunity to work on international legal projects. Each time I am convinced that although we all have similar rules in the EU, the way they are applied is often different. I know it's obvious, but I would like to emphasize that in Poland, but I think also in several other countries of the so-called new European Union in Central and Eastern Europe, the practice of applying public procurement law is characterized by a high degree of formalism. The approach means that the public procurement law is not perceived as a catalog of purchasing instruments, useful purchasing instruments, but as an obstacle, as a barrier to effective purchasing. Therefore, the first decision of the legislator in a crisis situation is often to remove this barrier. I believe the problem lies more in the practice of applying the law than in the content of the law itself. But I also believe that some structural elements of EU public procurement law are not sufficiently up to date in the context of current global economic phenomena. This is why I believe it's worth initiating a debate on its modernization, which will better prepare us for new challenges. Above all, such modernization should also send a signal to the member states that, when in fear, avoiding of the public procurement law is not needed. Tak było. Jeśli film Cię zainteresował, koniecznie zasubskrybuj mój kanał. Niebawem będzie tego więcej. Do zobaczenia.